Have you ever felt like you were still breathing, walking, showing up, but something essential inside you had quietly gone offline? This is not the kind of suffering that gets attention. It's subtle. It doesn't scream. There are no dramatic collapses, no obvious crises. You keep going. You smile when needed. You answer emails. You cook dinner. And yet, behind all this movement, something deep in you has fallen into silence. The paralysis of adult life often doesn't look like failure. It looks like numbness, like someone who keeps waking up on time but no longer knows why. This invisible pain is more common than you think, especially among people who have done everything right. You followed the rules. You got the degree. You built the career, maybe even the family. And yet some quiet corner of your soul whispers that you've stopped living, even if technically you're alive. We don't talk enough about this, because it doesn't fit into our usual narratives of success or crisis. It's not depression in the clinical sense, though sometimes it's close. It's not laziness, though it often looks like fatigue. It's not lack of gratitude, though you might feel guilty for not feeling more joy. What you're experiencing may be the soul's way of calling for attention. In philosophy, particularly in the thought of Viktor Frankl, there's a concept called existential vacuum, a state where life loses its direction or meaning. It's not a breakdown. It's a slow drifting away from inner vitality, a loss of felt purpose. And unless we name it, it grows in silence. So let me ask you, when was the last time you felt truly alive? Not just entertained or distracted, but alive in a way that made suffering worth it. Don't rush to answer. Just hold the question. Sometimes the path back to inner life begins with this: honoring the silent ache instead of covering it up. Allowing yourself to admit with honesty that something in you has paused, not because you're weak, but because you need to listen. If this speaks to you, drop a comment with just one word: paused, and subscribe. This journey is just beginning. What if your current paralysis isn't a sign that you've failed, but a sign that you're finally ready to stop pretending? There's a quiet but devastating mistake many of us make when life stops moving. We assume it means we've done something wrong, that we've fallen behind, that we've lost our value. This confusion between stagnation and failure creates a double weight. Not only are we stuck, but we also blame ourselves for being stuck. And that shame becomes a wall that blocks any honest inquiry. But here's something you might need to hear. Feeling stagnant doesn't mean you've wasted your life. It may mean your inner world is no longer willing to run on autopilot. When we're young, life has built-in momentum: studies, relationships, careers. But what happens when those structures no longer carry the same meaning? What happens when outer progress no longer mirrors inner growth? Stagnation is not always regression. Sometimes it's the soul refusing to move in a direction that no longer makes sense. It's a quiet protest, a necessary stop to reorient yourself toward something real. The philosopher Julian Marius wrote that personal history isn't just what happened to us, it's what we do with what happened. In that sense, stagnation is a chapter, not a verdict. It can be the moment where your story begins to deepen, if you choose to read it that way. So ask yourself, have I truly failed, or have I simply paused long enough to hear that the old map no longer fits the terrain? Instead of rushing to fix the stillness, try listening to it. Let go of the cultural script that equates usefulness with motion. You are not a machine. Your worth is not measured in constant output. Real growth often begins in the places where nothing seems to be happening, yet underneath, everything is being rewritten. If you've ever judged yourself harshly for not doing enough, take a breath. Maybe this isn't a failure. Maybe it's the beginning of a deeper integrity. Sometimes, remaining still isn't passivity, it's wisdom. A refusal to keep running toward a life that no longer speaks to who you are becoming. There's a particular kind of emotional state that many people silently carry. Not despair, not joy, not even boredom. Just nothing. A quiet flatness. An inner stillness that doesn't soothe but rather numbs. And here's the dangerous part. We often mistake this numbness for peace. But peace is not the absence of feeling. Peace is the alignment of your inner world with what is true. What many call peace is actually resignation. A soul that's turned down the volume on life to avoid pain, only to lose access to joy as well. This emotional anesthesia is often a survival strategy. When hope has been disappointed too many times, when dreams have quietly died without a funeral, when the demands of daily life leave no room for authentic emotion, the heart shuts down, not out of weakness, but out of self-preservation. Yet, over time, this survival mode becomes a prison. You stop feeling deeply, you stop risking vulnerability, you stop engaging with the parts of life that once made you feel truly human. In Viktor Frankl's terms, this is not peace. It's the existential vacuum expanding. It's not calmness, it's a quiet cry for meaning. Frankl taught that when we can no longer find a reason to feel, the soul starts to fade, not suddenly, but slowly, silently, unnoticed. And because this numbness doesn't scream, we rarely confront it. We just adapt, we function, we smile politely. We avoid silence because silence threatens to reveal the truth we've buried, that we've made peace with an unlived life. So let me ask you, when did not feeling anything become your definition of strength? Who told you that being unshaken meant you were healed? Real peace is not the absence of turbulence, it's the presence of rootedness. It's the kind of calm that comes from facing life, not fleeing from it. If you find yourself in this emotional flatline, don't rush to fix it. Begin by naming it. Begin by noticing the subtle ways your soul has stopped reaching, and ask gently, what part of me stopped believing it was safe to feel? Because your capacity to feel is not your weakness, it is your way back. Sometimes what we call laziness, apathy, or lack of motivation is something far more sacred, something that deserves reverence, not reprimand. Sometimes, stagnation is grief in disguise. Grief is not always loud. It doesn't always come with tears or funerals. It can arrive in silence, taking the shape of fatigue, confusion, or emotional distance. It hides in the spaces where a part of you knows something ended, a dream, a role, a belief, but no one, not even you, stopped to mourn. This is one of the most overlooked truths in adult life. We don't only grieve people. We grieve futures that never came. We grieve versions of ourselves that we had to let go of. We grieve illusions that once gave us comfort. And when those inner losses go unrecognized, the soul doesn't move forward. It pauses. It goes quiet. Not out of defiance, but out of reverence. In psychological terms, this is a kind of frozen mourning. The psyche halts because it hasn't yet processed what it lost. In philosophy, grief is seen as an experience that confronts us with finitude, a moment when we encounter the limits of our power, the boundaries of our control. And that confrontation, if not honored, becomes paralysis. Think about it. When was the last time you truly allowed yourself to grieve what didn't happen? The job you didn't get, the relationship that faded without closure, the version of life you once imagined, but that reality quietly erased. We live in a culture that rushes to fix, to optimize, to move on. But the soul has its own rhythm, and sometimes it needs to stop, not because it's broken, but because it's in mourning. Julian Maria said that to live authentically is to integrate the past, not escape it. And part of that integration is allowing yourself to say without shame, I am grieving something I never got to name. So if your life feels paused, ask yourself this: what loss in me has gone unacknowledged? What part of my story still waits for a proper farewell? Because often, the key to movement isn't more force, it's more compassion. And healing doesn't begin with action. It begins with a gentle moment of recognition. Something in me is still grieving. Before the mind understands what's wrong, the body often whispers it. Long before we can name our inner paralysis, the body begins to speak in its own quiet language. Chronic fatigue that no amount of rest resolves, insomnia that defies logic, tension that clings to the shoulders and back, a constant urge to procrastinate, not out of laziness, but because the soul sees no purpose in moving. We tend to pathologize these symptoms. We call ourselves undisciplined, lazy, weak. But what if these so-called weaknesses are not signs of failure, but signals of meaninglessness? The psychiatrist Viktor Frankl observed that the human being is not simply driven by pleasure or success, but by meaning. When that meaning disappears, the organism reacts, not just psychologically but somatically. The body, in its wisdom, refuses to go on with a life that no longer feels real. Clinical experience confirms what philosophy has long taught. The human person is a unity. You cannot numb the soul without impacting the flesh. When we suppress grief, fear, or disorientation, it doesn't vanish. It moves into the body. And the body, unlike the mind, refuses to lie. That persistent tightness in your chest? It might not be anxiety. It might be sorrow that was never allowed to speak. That heaviness in the mornings where even getting out of bed feels like a mountain? It might not be laziness. It might be the weight of living without inner direction. These signs are not your enemy. They are your messengers. And ignoring them, or worse, punishing yourself for them, only deepens the paralysis. In the tradition of Thomas Aquinas, the human being is a composite of body and soul. What affects one touches the other. And if your soul has paused, your body will reflect that stillness, not as rebellion, but as protection. So instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" try asking, "What is my body trying to tell me that I've been unwilling to hear?" The healing process often begins not with more effort, but with more attention. Listening to the fatigue, honoring the tension, respecting the signals instead of overriding them. Because sometimes the exhaustion is not a problem to fix, but a message to translate. In a world obsessed with motion, one of the most seductive ways to hide our inner paralysis is to stay busy. You know the feeling. Endless to-do lists, calendars packed with meetings, constant messages to answer. At first glance, it looks like life is moving. But if you pause, really pause, you might notice something unsettling. Beneath the surface activity, nothing essential is being touched. You're moving, but not growing. Doing, but not becoming. This is the paradox of modern stagnation. It hides behind productivity. And this illusion is dangerous, because when you're busy, no one questions you, not even yourself. Activity gives the appearance of purpose. But sometimes it's just noise that protects us from silence. And in that silence lives the very truth we're afraid to face. Viktor Frankl warned against this kind of evasion. He observed that people often fill their lives with distraction, not because they are fulfilled, but because they are terrified of confronting the void within. He called it Sunday neurosis, the anxiety that creeps in when external duties pause and the emptiness becomes impossible to ignore. In that sense, productivity can become a form of anesthesia, a noble-looking mask over an existential drift. This doesn't mean work is bad. On the contrary, meaningful work is one of the most powerful ways to overcome stagnation. But when work becomes a substitute for interiority, when you use effort to avoid self-encounter, you risk building a life that is full, but hollow. So ask yourself, what am I actually moving toward? Who am I becoming through all this doing? And perhaps the most important question, when I'm alone and the tasks fall away, what part of me remains? Philosophically, true movement is not just about action, it's about direction. Thomas Aquinas spoke of final causes, the purpose toward which a being tends. Without that inner purpose, movement loses its meaning. You can be moving constantly and still going nowhere. So the next time you feel the urge to stay busy, pause, not to stop being responsible, but to ask whether your motion is aligned with something real. Because productivity without presence is just another form of escape. And your life deserves more than that. What do you do when life no longer makes sense? When the thread that once held your story together, a goal, a belief, a relationship, a role, suddenly snaps, the silence that follows can feel unbearable. There's movement on the outside, but inside, something has unraveled, and you're left standing in the ruins of a structure that once guided your every step. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, knew this terrain intimately. In the midst of unimaginable suffering, he discovered that the human being can endure almost anything, except a loss of meaning. His central insight was this: we are not driven merely by pleasure or power, but by purpose. When that purpose disappears, Paralysis follows. Frankl didn't see suffering as the ultimate problem. The true crisis, he believed, begins when suffering feels meaningless. And that's where many of us get lost, not in pain itself, but in the void it seems to create. We no longer know why we're doing what we're doing. We wake up, go to work, talk to people, but the inner compass is broken. So what can be done? Frankl's counsel was simple but radical. Meaning is not something you wait to receive. It's something you create by how you choose to respond to what happens to you. This doesn't mean inventing a fantasy to escape your pain. It means finding, even in your suffering, something or someone worth serving. Something beyond the narrow orbit of the self. He called this self-transcendence. The idea that we find ourselves not by turning inward obsessively, but by committing to something greater, a cause, a person, a responsibility. In doing so, the paralyzed self begins to move again, not because it has all the answers, but because it has remembered why it's alive. Frankl's wisdom confronts us with a question we rarely ask. What or who am I willing to live for, even when life feels unbearable? That question doesn't erase the pain, but it draws a thread through it. A thread strong enough to hold the weight of your existence. A thread that reconnects you to meaning, not as a theory, but as a path. And in that reconnection, the soul, long paralyzed, takes its first quiet step forward. Insight is powerful, but insight alone doesn't always heal what stagnates. Sometimes, what the mind understands, the soul still resists. That's why moments of clarity need to be followed by moments of practice, not performance, but presence. Here's a simple exercise. Not to fix yourself, but to begin listening, deeply, honestly, to what in you has gone silent. For the next 7 days, take 15 minutes each day. Sit alone, in quiet, with pen and paper, and write one question at the top of the page. What in me is waiting to be heard? That's it. No edits, no judgment, no cleverness. Just let the words come. You might begin with confusion, with nothing. That's normal. Stay, wait. Let the silence speak in fragments. Let the hand move before the mind tries to organize it. What you're doing is not journaling for productivity. You're not trying to track goals or solve problems. You're offering your interior world something it rarely gets, a chance to speak without interruption. This kind of writing bypasses the defenses. It makes space for parts of you that have been buried under noise, fears you've numbed, longings you've dismissed, griefs you've never named. And when these parts find a voice, even if shaky, even if incoherent, the soul begins to thaw. There's a reason this practice works. In both psychology and philosophy, the act of naming carries profound power. As Frankl suggested, when suffering is given meaning, it ceases to be merely destructive. And meaning often begins with articulation, with putting into words what we were afraid to even feel. So don't look for beauty in what you write. Look for truth. Look for honesty. Look for the raw places that finally feel safe enough to speak. At the end of the week, don't analyze it. Don't try to categorize what came. Just sit with it. Read it slowly. Let it reflect you back to yourself. And then ask, what here have I been refusing to feel? What here points to a movement I've been too afraid to begin? Sometimes, it's not grand gestures that restart a paralyzed life. It's this: a quiet page, an open heart, and the courage to listen without needing to immediately understand. There's a kind of silence that's not born from emptiness, but from incubation. When you feel paralyzed, it's easy to panic. The world expects motion, answers, confidence. You scroll through images of progress, people launching projects, making plans, chasing goals, and inside you, nothing moves. And so you conclude, something must be wrong with me. But not all stillness is sickness. Not every pause is a problem to be solved. In fact, some pauses are sacred. There are seasons in a human life when the soul withdraws, not because it's dying, but because it's forming something new. It's a gestation period, invisible, slow, unglamorous, like seeds breaking underground, hidden from sight, doing the quiet work of transformation. But we often lack the moral patience to honor these seasons. We want immediate results, visible change, clear direction. And so we force ourselves forward, into decisions we're not ready to make, into roles we no longer believe in, into motions that betray our inner rhythm. And in doing so, we risk a deeper rupture. We interrupt the formation of a more authentic self. Thomas Aquinas understood that true growth is not rushed. He spoke of the natural law, the inner order and timing by which things unfold. Just as a tree cannot be forced to bloom out of season without damage, neither can the soul be coerced into premature clarity. So the invitation is this: can you remain faithful to your own winter? Can you respect what's still germinating in silence, even when the world asks for fruit? This kind of waiting is not passive. It's active trust. It's moral courage. It's the discipline to say, I will not manufacture movement just to appear alive. I will wait for the voice within me that speaks with truth. Because when you violate your own timing, you may succeed externally, but fracture internally. You may perform life, but lose the thread of meaning that gives it depth. So, if your soul is quiet right now, let it be. Not because you've given up, but because something deeper is forming, something that needs time and darkness and space. And when it's ready, it will move, not with panic, but with purpose. In the Russian literary tradition, winter is never just a season. It's a metaphor for the human condition, for silence, for waiting, for death that prepares for resurrection. Tolstoy, perhaps more than any other writer, understood this rhythm. In his later works, especially in The Death of Ivan Ilyich, he shows us that the most meaningful transformations often begin where everything seems to have ended. When the surface of life is frozen and no clear future can be seen, something hidden begins to stir. Ivan Ilyich, a successful judge, lives according to convention, chasing position, comfort, approval. But when he faces his own mortality, the facade begins to crack. He enters a long inner winter, a period of denial, numbness, despair. At first he resists it, then slowly he begins to listen. Beneath the silence, a question takes root. What if I've lived wrongly? And in that question, a new self is born. What Tolstoy teaches us is that winter is not the enemy, it's the threshold, the stillness that prepares the soul for something truer. In life, as in nature, not all growth is visible. There are seasons when we must die to old patterns, old ambitions, old illusions, not because we have failed, but because something deeper is calling us to live more honestly. If your life feels frozen now, if nothing is blooming and the cold seems endless, you are not broken. You may simply be in your inner winter. And winters are not meaningless. They are necessary. Without them, the soil remains shallow. The roots cannot deepen. The soul cannot mature. Julian Maria said that what makes us human is not the ability to plan, but the ability to hope, to stand in winter and trust that spring will return. So do not rush. Do not panic. Trust the silence. Trust the stillness. And more than anything, trust that what feels like death may, in time, reveal itself as preparation. Because the seasons of the soul are real. And just like in Tolstoy's world, winter is never the end. It's the hidden beginning. If this journey resonated with you, leave a comment with the word winter. And don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started.